they're out. Keep an eye on the ships that are out there. They're a really good tell. There's a lot of ships that are anchored out there, so look for them to be swinging. They'll probably be sitting with the current, not the wind tomorrow, because it looks pretty light. So I think when you're sailing on that course with a light north or northwesterly and an outgoing tide, look hard at the left, and you can look up into Whitehall Bay. If you look on a chart, there's this thing called Whitehall Bay up into the left, and a lot of times there's big pressure shots that come out of there, so it can be favorable with breeze on the left and current relief on the left. So look hard that way. And I would, a lot of people kind of assume then you would want to be in the deep water for the downwind, and you see a lot of folks come around and jibe and go into the deep water to get into current, ripping downwind. And I don't know, Mike sailed out there probably more than I have, but I feel like lots of times that's not the move for whatever reason. It seems like there's better breeze closer to shore.
Yeah, just want to be, in these boats, you don't go that far to the edges, so you just want to be in pressure.
So that's what I'd be keeping an eye on. And then, look around 1 o'clock, between 1 and 2 is when the current is supposed to theoretically shift, but use the crab pots and the container ships and just what you see on the race course more than that, because it's not always super reliable on the forecast.
If you go on the NOAA website, there's a tide prediction they use for shipping at the 92 mark, like the last red mark before the bridge. They do a prediction of the current under that mark. You can find it on the NOAA website. It's really handy because they take into account rainfall and weather and all that stuff. And they use it for the ships going in and out of Port of Baltimore. It's really handy. So check that out.
It's more accurate.
It's not as accurate as looking at the ships when they're out there on the moorings, but they predict the current speed, direction, and timing. And it lets you know when it doesn't necessarily line up with high and low tide, if that makes sense.
Well, and I think they do a better job of actually predicting the surface water moving, because we get duped here. When the tide is coming up, the current on the surface is oftentimes still going out if there's been a big rain and the dams are open or anything like that. So it's surface current is a lot different than the tidal flow out there.
Yeah, the red 92, yeah.
Looked at that.
But it's I always Google NOAA tides and currents, and then you find it.
Just Google the same thing every time.
I literally don't know the web address.
So, a really important point that Zeke brought up is you also have the crab traps here in Annapolis, and they're very helpful. I've sailed out here at times where just going an extra 100 yards, you can find a lot more current relief, and you can really read that on those crab traps. It's kind of like sailing in Portland, where you have these telltale indicators everywhere, and you can really read what the current's doing by keeping an eye on those, and keep an eye on them in general too, because you don't want to pick one up on your rudder.
And you just got to be really careful at the weather mark. There's so much to be gained and lost, because that's usually the furthest out in the deep water in that kind of north-northwest breeze direction. And so everybody's trying to get out to the starboard ley line, and you're in that max current that's pushing against you, and it can be sporting. So be patient out there and look for opportunities to not lose. Coming in on port can be good.
So as far as setting up for this lighter breeze, well, first off, there's always more than one way to do things. For instance, on my boats, we never go below 2015. But what we do when it gets lighter is we push the mast butt back. I know not everyone does it that way. Some people don't get too aggressive with their mast butts, and they go below 2015 when it gets lighter. So whatever suits your style, I'm not going to say necessarily what's right or wrong, but I'm guessing this weekend you're going to be at the low end of the tune range. You're probably going to want a decent amount of sag. Again, even today we saw some differences in what people like and how they like to set up. Some people go as tight as about 2 fingers. Everybody know how to read your forestay tension on the old style loose gauge. Want to be able to put your at least 2 fingers. And what I'm driving at is, in my case, I like it closer to 3 fingers. I like it very loose. Some people don't like to sail that way. They'll sail closer to 2 fingers of sag, and that can be a pretty noticeable difference. And the one thing I would recommend is the more sag that you sail with, the more scallops you should see in your Genoa. Because when the wire sags, you've got to move the draft back by by softening your halyard. So, you know, if you're sailing next to someone who doesn't have quite as many scallops, that might be because they have a tighter head stay. That's one correlation that I've seen out there. And Zeke can talk about that. Tony tends to not quite sail with as much forestay sag as I do, and we all know he goes awfully well. So.
Bomar does the setup.
Yeah. So like we use 2 fingers with the backstay on. Robbie also measures it with the backstay on too, right?
Right. But I pull my blocks when I measure my forestay. I pull my blocks all the way up and I tape them up.
Yeah.
So there's no hanging down on the bridle at all, and I do measure with my backstay on.
Are they unwound, or do you unwind the backstay?
Yes. So my backstay. So my rule of thumb is when you're sailing upwind and you have your backstay completely off and the blocks are just hanging, you want them to hang about this far from where. So
Yeah.
So it's going to
6
be
to 8
fairly
6 to 8
loose.
inches or so.
I tell you, I sometimes sail with my backstay so loose that I have to clear it on the leech of the main because it's so loose that it'll get caught on that top batten to lure to the main.
But when you measure the 3 fingers,
And my backstay is very loose.
Very loose.
Very
You
loose.
unwind
and
it all the
blocks
way.
are taped all the way up, so the blocks aren't even
Yeah.
pulling down on it at all. And I have very light blocks like most of you do.
Or take a leg off.
What's that?
Take a leg off the backstay.
Yeah, that
You can
works
do it
too.
that way.
Yeah.
And kind of what we're saying though is some people take the backstay completely off
You're right.
to measure their forestay. And basically, if you have your backstay off, you're probably going to see more fingers than when you put your backstay on. That's
Yeah. So on Tony's boat, we use 2 fingers and then about 2 inches of pre-bend, maybe 1 3/4 inches. And then we never go below 2015, especially here, because like as the weekend comes, and you saw a little bit of that today, there's a lot of powerboat chop, and just having the rig at that 15-10 number, it's just too sloppy, and the rig just moves around a little too much in the boat. So staying at that 2015 just keeps everything a little more stabilized when you're going through that really shitty powerboat Annapolis chop. And then today we went out at base, which is 2015, and then we did 2 steps up, which put us at 27, 24 as we got out into the building southerly, and we felt pretty good at that. We didn't move our mast butt at all today. It was still our base place for that. But yeah.
So does everybody know the rule of thumb that I use at least is once you're fully hiked and you're going upwind, I like to see my leeward upper moving just the tiniest amount. If it's sagging a good bit, chances are your rig's not tight enough. And if it's not sagging at all, it's like bone tight, you might be a little too tight on your rig. So that's a really good visual reference to check yourself. You know, once you get all dialed in and like I say, you're completely on the rail and going upwind, you can observe your leeward shroud.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I've just been thinking about kind of the mast butt position and when you know when it's time to move that. And I think the best way to gauge that is based on the overbend wrinkles or the speed wrinkles that you see in the lower part of your main. And that comes into play especially in the lighter stuff that we might see when your rig's where it is and you're still looking for a little bit more. If you don't see any overbend wrinkles down low, that means that the bottom of your mast is too straight and it's too full and too draggy, and that's a good indicator to move the mast butt back a little bit to try to stretch out the bottom part of your main and get it set up a little bit better for light air. So using the visual cue of just how far back the overbend wrinkles in your main are going, or if you don't see them at all, you certainly should be thinking about moving the mast butt back a little bit. And then in the windier stuff, you go up on your rig, but if you see the overbend is going, from your spreaders all the way to your clew, that's telling you that the bottom of your main is washing out. It's too stretched out, and that's a good indicator to move the mast butt forward. So I think all of the rig tune stuff with the shrouds and the head stay tension is really good, but don't ignore the bottom part of your main, which is largely controlled by the mast butt position.
Zeke, would that also possibly mean that you just need to have a little bit more tension on your lowers?
Could be. It could be, yeah. But if you're looking up your rig and it looks like, the sag is about right and everything is about right, that's your kind of last gauge for the mast butt position. But yes, you could do that. But, the lowers are going to also pull the middle of the mast to weather by tightening them. The mast butt is just kind of sending the lower part of the mast forward and back. So it's dictating the stretch there a little bit more.
And we generally have to adjust our rig just a little bit when we move our mast butt. We have a matrix that tells us when we go from heavy to medium to light. We usually have to adjust a wind or two on each shroud to get it right back to 2015. So we always had a really good matrix, and then when we do move the mast butt, we have an adjustment matrix for how to get it to get right back to the sailor.
I think we had a question.
Yeah, so, how far back do you bring the mast butt? How far forward do you push it?
So we move ours about 7 millimeters is our steps. So we have 3 settings within that. So we do have like a super light one that we never ever use unless it's like super flat water. And then we have 2, the base setting, and then 2 farther forward settings.
What?
3.
53, 60. We have little cutouts, so we can just slap it in front of the set.
So, what speed?
It all varies on wind speeds and sea states.
Right.
So it's like if it's flatter water, we'll move the mast butt a little earlier. If it's still choppy, we'll hold off a little bit on that. And then it's kind of where we are in the rig as well. It varies. So it's sea state's a very big factor in that. So like we'll set the shrouds for something, and then we'll look and then be like, all right, it's pretty flat water. Our next move, we'll talk about it like, all right, our next move is a mast butt 1 forward, or our next move is more shrouds. So, and it kind of gives us like almost, we use it as like a half step in between each of our shroud settings as you go up in the range.
And one thing I wanted to mention, so they sail with a little tighter forestay, but he brought up something really important, which is when you have if you sail with a real soft forestay like I do, actually out here, if you see big waves coming, we're usually taking a little pull on the backstay to steady up the rig. Because as soft as our forestay is, if you get in big powerboat chopping stuff, the whole genoa bounces. So I've talked to John Mollicott about this, and he and I both do the same thing, which is, in that situation, we may actually pull a little backstay on just to steady up the rig, and then we'll pull it back off again once things settle down. And I will say too, if it's just crazy sloppy, period. And there's not a lot of rhyme or reason to it. You can't predict it. Sometimes I won't soften up my headstay at all as much as I otherwise might. So we might sail with a little tighter headstay if it's just crazy sloppy in general. So.
But it's an interesting point, I think, to just the difference between flat water or choppy conditions comes into play anytime you're doing a Friday and then a weekend. Like tomorrow out of the northwest, not a lot of boat traffic. It's going to be pretty flat most likely. So don't get married to those settings that feel good on Friday going into the weekend. And it's it's winter time now, so it's not going to be crazy, but there'll be more power boats out for sure on the weekend.
Anybody have any questions? Anything that you'd like to ask about or talk about? Anything on your mind? Guys got anything else that comes to mind that'll be good information for the weekend?
Like you're saying, when the powerboat chop hits and the super light stuff, like don't be scared to ease the genoa aggressively. Like James, how much do you normally like ease when there's like a big wave set coming? Like
That much on the spares.
like yeah, fully to the lifeline just to keep the boat moving in this big stuff.
Yeah, it's, and then you have to hope the best. And is there a corresponding adjustment on the mainsail?
Yep, yeah, the mainsail gets a little bit of ease as well.
Half of that?
Yeah, probably or so.
Probably less than half of that.
Yeah.
Just enough that you can visually look up and see that your leech is wide
Twist it
open.
off.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're trying to generate helm load,
Yeah.
like in that situation, right? So that's why the Genoa goes way out.
Just keep the big girl moving.
Is it worth going banging the corner on the left side?
It can be. It can be. It's Hard to say. Like a lot of times you'll see people really want to send it left and it doesn't quite work because the bottom of the course gets these little right puffs for some reason. But it is not uncommon to see people reaching out of Whitehall Bay very far in front, like having overstood with the tide against you. You'll have to see what it looks like out there, but it's worth looking very carefully at.
So another thing, and Zeke can speak to this, depending on, he's got more experience with it, because one thing that think about, depending on how the course is set up and what the wind direction is the current also goes out in this channel too. So sometimes if the left side of the course gets you more into this channel, you could actually get into some adverse current. So that's something to keep an eye on and that could possibly come into play.
Yeah, I mean, just take notes on it should be going out when we're leaving, when we're sailing out tomorrow, so just watch all the various crab pots that you sail by. But the other bit that's going to be tricky about tomorrow is that the breeze is supposed to be dying and marching to the east, which is not great, but that sort of complicates the theory of the left being heavily favored based on current and leftover puffs. So you got to watch it as it dies. You may see some pretty big swings right, which will complicate things.
So another thing to just think about that I saw from the coach boat today, there's also some varying lead position thoughts. Tony tends to carry his lead back a little farther, which I tend to do as well. When I sail, I like to pull the foot of the genoa in closer to the shroud base. But if it's real light and choppy, and I don't think you're going to see that in a westerly though, you can push the lead forward and really get more drive out of the bottom of the genoa. Again, out of a westerly direction like this, I would tend to bring the foot of the genoa in close to the shroud base. But there's certainly some people who like to push the lead farther forward and they get more drive out of the bottom of their sail. I noticed from the coach boat today, Tony's genoa, maybe with the lead back, the lead just matched up a slightly better than on the boat that had the lead farther forward. It just looked like the slot was a little cleaner, a little bit more open up leach on the boat that had the lead farther back on Tony's boat. It's just something I noticed. And I haven't looked out from the coach boat too terribly much because I'm usually in the boat, but at any rate, that's what I noticed today. So.
Any other questions or anything else we could do to help? Sweet, more beer. Appreciate it. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you so much, Jack.